Welcome, Sherlockian friends. Welcome to Sherlock Mondays. I am Edward G. Pettit of the Rosenbach Museum and Library in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. And we're going on a monthly biblioventure through the stories of Sherlock Holmes. And today's episode is The Adventure of the Solitary Cyclist. And I am going to record this on my computer because I usually do, and I forgot. There we go. It's always available on YouTube, but I like to have a little file that's just clean.
Mhm.
Joining me for this episode are two co-hosts. Welcome back to Anastasia Klimchynskaya. Hi, Anastasia.
Hi, Ed. Pleasure to be back.
It's been a while. We didn't realize it's been since like last April, last spring.
Spring, yeah. I was on a different side of the Atlantic.
And finally, we get the pleasure of having Madeline Quiñones on the show. Hi, Madeline.
Hi.
I'm so happy to have you here. We've met through the
Oh,
Sherlockian
thank you.
community and become friends, and you are absolutely wonderful in the things that you do.
Thank
I'm
you.
really
You're so
happy to
sweet.
get you on this show. Well, everyone, for 30 weeks in 2023 and 2024, we deduced, deciphered, and dissected Arthur Conan Doyle's Sherlock Holmes adventures in a kind of conversational annotation. You can see all those episodes on the Rosenbach's YouTube channel. Now we are continuing the Biblioventure in a monthly series. Every month, a distinguished Sherlockian or two joins me to discuss one of the stories in the order they were first published. And if you are watching live right now, thank you. I see you all out there. The chat is for you, but I also ask you to please subscribe to this channel if you're not already, and to like these videos if you so choose. I also ask you to please consider making a donation to the Rosenbach or by becoming a member. You can do this at our website, rosenbach.org. Your support helps us create programs like this and care for our collections. And Sherlock Monthly is brought to you by the generous support of Lisa Washington. So let me introduce our two co-hosts for today. Anastasia, I'll do a shorter one for you because we've had your, longer introductions in
Mhm.
Sherlock Mondays, and many people here already know you. You can find her in so many of those episodes. Her Sherlockian cred abounds. She is currently a visiting assistant professor of English. Did I get this right? At Illinois
Yes.
Wesleyan University, where
Mhm.
he teaches primarily Victorian literature, Gothic, and science fiction. That's why I love you so much. All these things that I love.
Yeah, I get to make my students read Sherlock Holmes and Dracula and all this stuff we talk about on here, and then they walk in and they have very strong opinions, which is great.
Good. All righty.
I mean, I had a student who walked in, he was like, I think Dr. Jekyll is the character I hate the most in all of literature. Like, I hate this guy. He's a psychopath. I want to strangle him. I'm like, well, I don't have a counter argument for you.
There you go. I love that. Um, Madeline Quiñones is an artist and a writer who does graphic design for a living. She's the current head of the John H. Watson Society, the junior editor of canonical annotations for the Baker Street Almanac. She also has a lapsed webcomic, The Adventures of Professor Moriarty, and you can find her art sprinkled around various Sherlockian publications, sometimes on the cover of the Baker Street Journal. But her biggest contribution to the fandom might be podcasting. She has her own Moriarty-focused show, Dynamics of a Podcast. She has been a correspondent on the Watsonian Weekly for the past few years, and she is currently a correspondent for I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere. Welcome, Madeline.
Well,
Hi.
half of these I didn't even know. Where do you sleep?
There's a reason that I actually have hardly published any episodes of my own podcast in the past year. So, uh, no, it's it's actually really tricky juggling everything. But people keep asking me to do things, and I keep being like, yes, I want to do the thing. So
Yeah.
that's
So
that's my weakness.
the older I get, the less I say yes because you get asked to do so many things and you want to do them. Like, yes, that
Right.
sounds
Yeah.
great. And now I have to
Well,
hold
yeah.
back
I've said
sometimes.
no a couple of times even. It
That's a
doesn't sound,
good start. I think one of the wisest pieces of advice a mentor or an advisor gave me is you need to learn to say no.
yeah. Yeah, no. I
Well,
definitely understand that.
Not
Madeline,
that I'm following that advice because, like this year I had 3 different book projects that were, under contract. So don't be like me.
Madeline, tell the audience a little bit about what you do for the for iHost for I Hear Sherlock Everywhere.
Oh, so it started with the presentation that I gave at the Dayton conference last year, which was running through all the Sherlockian podcasts I knew of at the time, including this one, which was 18. And then I was told that there were several others that I'd missed. I was like, oops. And then I found out, oh no, there's a bunch more even that other people were also not aware of. And uh yeah, so Scott Monty was like, "Hey, do you want to do a write-up on these podcasts for the blog on iHost?" And I was like, "Sure." And then he was like, "Wait a second. Would you like to do a segment?" And I was like, yes." So so I just go through, I've been trying to go through chronologically as much as possible because it helps keep things organized in my
Yeah.
head, but going through all the Sherlockian podcasts of which I'm aware, which is over 30. It's almost like about 3 dozen now. Um,
And not
and
all of them are even available anymore, correct?
one of them is not available
Just one?
anymore. Yeah,
Okay.
yeah. So, which is sad because it sounds like it was really cool.
Hmm.
But
Well,
yeah.
I enjoy listening to that segment.
Well,
I'm glad
thank
it's on
you.
there. It's always fun to hear about these new ventures, and old ventures, uh,
Right.
some of which I've heard, but I think iHose is the only regular podcast that I absolutely listen to on a consistent basis. It's not time, like
Right.
doing your own shows, it's really hard to make time for all the others.
Oh,
And
understandable.
one day I'll just get to dive into everything one day, like I'm ever going to retire, right?
And I mean, there's so much out there and I don't enjoy all of it, but also I'm not going to be uh super critical of anything. Like my philosophy is I will give you the information that you need to make a decision about whether or not you're going to check it out. And then if you check it out, you decide for yourself whether or not you like it.
Except if you cover this one, then it's going to be like the greatest show. No, I'm kidding.
Oh, I'm going to have so
I
much
don't
fun
need any
covering this one.
buttering up.
I
So
have to
yeah.
ask, so I don't know if you probably know, there's this upcoming Watson TV show that's
Hmm.
that's coming. I mean, I guess it's not a podcast, it's a TV show, but um I'm wondering what you think of that, or
Well,
what you haven't seen it, but what you're thinking about from what we know.
we are going to actually cover that on the Watsonian Weekly. We're already covering Sherlock and Co. on the Watsonian Weekly because Watson is the podcaster
Mhm.
of that podcast. That's the conceit of that story.
Mhm.
So it's a perfect excuse for us to spend, 45 minutes talking about each episode. But we are going to be covering the new Watson show. And I'm excited for it because we've never had an adaptation that is just like purely Watson focused
Yeah.
like
Yeah.
this. So I think it's really exciting. I'm looking forward to seeing the way that they adapt the different characters. I mean, we're gonna get a Moriarty, we're gonna get a Mary. I'm do we get a Shinwell Johnson even? I think we get like a Shinwell Johnson. Um, so which no if anybody who is still reading through the canon for the first time doesn't know who that is, but that's one of the later stories.
Do you
But
guys, when these things come out, do you want to know everything before it's out? Because I on
no,
purpose try
no.
to know
I
nothing.
don't have time for that.
I don't I
I mean,
don't
I
want to
try
know
to know nothing on
nothing.
purpose. I want to have it like
I mean,
wanted to
I'll
start it
watch,
right
the
away.
trailer or
Yeah.
whatnot, but I don't have time to go digging for the interviews or
I
whatever.
haven't even watched a trailer for it, so I
The
just want
trailers
to.
look interesting. I
Yeah.
The
mean,
trailer
it.
is very well done, I think.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
All
Yeah,
righty.
I'm
Well,
excited for it.
that will be starting up soon if you're watching this show in January. And I look forward to watching that too. Well, let us start on this story. But before we even start on the story, I'd love to. I just want to let people know that the manuscript of it exists. Now we find this now in a lot of early stories, manuscripts of Doyle's stories didn't he didn't save them and they don't exist. Only a few of them do. But the later stories he saved and even bound a bunch of them. And this was one of the stories that he bound, The Adventure of the Solitary Cyclist. Um, it is in a it's not a secret that Glenn Moranker has it. Great collector, Glenn S. Moranker has the Solitary Cycle. He actually has the first 40 pages of it. It's one of those weird things because I've shown this with the Empty House manuscript that the Rosenbach has, and that he does them in exercise books, and then he bound them in these great vellum bindings that he did for about 10 of the stories. And apparently, though, when the Solitary Cyclist was bound, only the first two exercise books were bound, and there was a third that just has the final 2 pages in it,
Oh,
not bound in it. No one knows how, or maybe they do, and I just haven't discovered it yet. Why this error happened, that it didn't get bound with it. So that someone else has the final two, as far as I know. Maybe that has changed in recent days, and somebody could let me know. But so the manuscript exists, and one of the interesting things about the manuscript is that the title of the story was not The Adventure of the Solitary Cyclist. It was The Adventure of the Solitary Man. And then on the manuscript, it's crossed out and cyclist, and Doyle writes cyclist there. And even in the story, that it's when it's mentioned a solitary cyclist, you get that phrase in the story. It was man, and he crossed it out. So it was a revision as he's going through it, or maybe when he's even done, that he decides to put that focus on there. And Because whenever I think of the story, I think of Violet Smith as the solitary cyclist. And yet for Doyle, she's not. It's the guy following her.
well, the story refers to both of them as the solitary
Yes.
cyclists, which
But of
was
course they're not,
interesting.
because they're riding together. She
Um,
wants to be the solitary cyclist, obviously. She doesn't want this guy following her, but they turned out to be, together.
the ideally solitary cyclist.
Hmm. Well, it was published in the uh, Strand magazine,
The way
January
you
1904.
hesitated there, Ed, like where was it published? Where was it published?
Well, because it's dual published, and I mentioned the Strand first, but that's January 1904. Would have come out at the end of December, and the Collier's, an American edition, is dated 12/26, 1903. Who I mean, they're coming out simultaneously. And The Strand cover, let me share that. Um, I just love to share this stuff. I love us to recognize that how original readers encountered these things. Good, there we
Mhm.
go. They Doyle gets his name up top here. A. Conan Doyle, Sherlock Holmes. This is we've there's his name is on most of the. I think there's two of the stories in this whole Return series where they don't actually put his name on the cover of the Strand. And this is one. But it's interesting too that it's also W. Jacobs has a new serial story in this issue. Jacobs these days we really only know from the story The Monkey's Paw, that many of us have read, and that's the only story that has survived. And he was a very popular fiction writer humorous stories, ghost stories. And actually, I just think the fact that he shares up there at the top of the cover page is the Strand letting their readers know, like, hey, there's a Jacob story in here. You do not want to miss this. So, that's how popular he is at the time. And if we look in the Strand later in the issue, his story is called Dialstone Lane. And here it is. Can you see that?
Mm-hmm.
It is it's a comic story, and it's an entire novel that they serialize. And as you look at the pictures, you can tell that they're done in more of a comic style, and that's what people get to do. And this one especially, clearly a comic style picture. And important to note too that especially, and this weird, it's not colored, and it turns up like green on this imaging that. It was done on when it was digitized for Google, but it would be completely black and white. But style of illustrations need to match the tone of the story as well. So Sherlock Holmes pageant illustrations for Holmes don't often look comic. Funny things can happen sometimes in the stories, but the illustrations themselves don't look comic. But here they will match it, of course. And so this is something the readers would have encountered in that first Strand issue. This guy's looking a lot like me right here. Well, he's got more hair on his head. But if you go through this issue, and you can find these issues online. Look, the next article is about Marie Curie and discovering radium and pictures of her. These are the way people encounter these stories. And then this I love. There's a whole article on trousers in sculpture. I just, and I guess at the time too, everybody's used to seeing classical statuary, and somebody's decided to write a piece, like, hey, but all modern statues have trousers on these men.
That is so funny. I've got to go back and read this article.
And just in depth about the trouser sculpture. How to do that. So, of course, at the time, hey, they're mostly only making statues of men, so that's why it gets the focus. But yeah, trousers in sculpture. If you want to know anything about that, there's an old Strand article for you from January 1904. You can look up.
I love it.
The Strand also opens with, I'm sorry, I forgot to share that. It also opens with the illustration for the story, which is a spoiler. But
Yeah,
this
I
is
noticed
this
that.
totally gives it away. Now this started with I mentioned this last time too. This started with
Final problem.
Final Problem, with the death of Sherlock Holmes and him and Moriarty just starting to go off into the falls. And uh Doyle seemed to be annoyed by this a little. I read there's a piece I read somewhere with him mentioning that he didn't like this, but maybe not about Solitary Cyclist, but there's definitely a note. This is in the letters. In the letters edition that came out, edited by Lellenberg, Stashower, and Foley, which is it's Arthur Conan Doyle, A Life in Letters, but it's mostly A Life in Letters to My Ma'am, because I think 75% of these letters must be written to his mother. Maybe they were the only ones that are really saved, but it'd be nice to have letters to other people, more letters to other people if they ever do more of his letters in an edition. But he had written a story in the Brigadier Gerard series, set in the Napoleonic Wars. And he objects in this letter to the editor, Greenhoff Smith, about take the last of the Brigadiers also. My whole object. We talk about the story. Oh, it is not right to print such a story. Unnecessary illustration. It's bad economy to spoil a 200-pound story by the intrusion of a 3-guinea engraving. Little like, don't put cheap illustrations on my stories. You're paying me prime bucks for this. But then he says, take the last of the Brigadiers, an illustration for a Brigadier Gerard story. My whole object is to give the reader a stunning shock by Napoleon lying dead at the crisis of the adventure. But the story is prefaced by a large picture of Napoleon lying dead, which simply knocks the bottom out of the whole thing from the storyteller's point of view. So he was aware of this. Now, maybe he didn't care as much with the Sherlock stories, but because that's written right around the time he has sent he's working on Solitary Cyclist. But this story has that illustration to start with. And the Collier's edition has this, it's published in America at the same time. And the Collier's cover illustration isn't from this story. It's Sherlock smoking his pipe on the floor. At first I thought, because this looks like a little bit like the Paget illustration from The Man with the Twisted Lip, where he sits on the pillows on the floor and he smokes all night long, gets an ounce of shag tobacco, pile of shag tobacco beside him, he smokes all night long, figuring out, who Hugh Boone is and what happened to Neville St. Clair. But actually it's not, because this is in Baker Street quarters here, by everything around him. And that smoking that pipe was in someone else's house. But this is gorgeous, isn't it? I mean, it's that I feel, well, especially for the cover illustrations, and Monica as a you can chime in on this. I think that Frederick Dorr Steele, for these, he often goes for this kind of iconic look, like he's creating this almost like this brand image of Sherlock Holmes. Am I wrong?
Like generating like a genuine cover illustration.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I mean, Sherlock also, Sidney Paget was just starting when Sherlock Holmes was just starting to get popular. So Paget kind of creates the original iconic image, but
Yeah.
by the time the return comes around, like Holmes is an icon.
Yeah.
So Frederick Dorr Steele has to be thinking about that.
Yeah, Dorr Steele's using that, especially for because his model is William Gillette, the actor playing Holmes. So, and that's how he wants to present him. Like, this is the public image of Holmes.
Oh yeah.
All righty. The other interesting thing about the Strand, or about the Colliers, that I'll point out is I love their titles for the stories, their title banners. Last
that
week
is
was really
gorgeous.
great, and I'll zoom in here, and yeah, I love their title banners they do. And look, he's got a skull here. The last
I
story,
covet your
Norwood Builder,
skull.
filled with skulls. So, no disguised beard here. It's a skeleton.
That's great.
Chasing her down the road here.
Okay, but being
Death
chased
is
by a
pursuing.
skeleton on a bicycle would just be so much more terrifying. Like, can you imagine?
Yeah. And they also, this is included for the first time. In this new return series, they hadn't written this yet, but it says here under the title of the story, this is the fourth story of the new Sherlock Holmes series, which began in the household number for October. The preceding adventures were those of the Empty House, the Norwood Builder, and the Dancing Men. The next story, The Adventure of the Priory School, will be published in the household number for February, dated January 30, 1904. There will be 12 stories in this new Sherlock Holmes series. They're really going out of their way to inform the readers, like, not only may have missed a few, you need to get some back issues, but stay tuned, because this is a series and there will be even more coming up. I find it interesting that suddenly they realized that, oh, we need to make sure the readers know all this, that it's a series, and they need to keep buying these issues so they can get every one.
It was Colliers who commissioned the return, wasn't it?
Yeah,
So
he signs with them before the Strand, but he knows all along
Yeah.
he's still going to sign with the Strand.
Right, right. But I'm just thinking like I know that I don't remember off the top of my head, but I know that they paid a phenomenal amount of money for the return. So this sounds very much like hey, we got to make sure that we are getting back on our investment.
Well, and especially since, I mean, I think we've talked about this on the show before. Uh, this isn't a serialized novel. These are standalone stories. So, you could just open it, read the story, be done, and walk away. You don't need to have read the other however many stories to like understand what's happening, which is great for getting people into Sherlock Holmes because they can pick it up anywhere. But at the same time, that means that, there's not going to be that cliffhanger that's going to make people want to buy the next issue.
Let's get to this story so we can get through it all today in a reasonable amount of time. I might run out of ale. I'm drinking ale today. I might run out if I don't speed it up. Claire Danes, who watches us from New
Hey.
Zealand, that you know very well, Madeline,
She
because you
is my best
illustrated.
friend of 13 years now.
Wow, and you illustrated a book of hers, didn't you? Her Hound.
Yeah.
What is it called?
Uh, Hold on. I have it right here. It is The Hunting of the Narc.
Hunting of the Narc. Um,
Mm-hmm.
that's wonderful.
Sherlock Holmes Through the Looking Glass. So it's a bunch of poems that she does that are all based on Lewis Carroll poems, but they're adapted for Sherlock Holmes, which is amazing. She has like such an ear for meter, and I'm
Yeah.
so jealous because I can't do poetry. And then at the back is a retelling of the Musgrave Ritual, hence the cover, which starts out fantastical, kind of, and then ends more serious, but has definitely a kinder ending for Rachel Howells, a more feminist take on the story.
Well, she kind of became the poet laureate for Sherlock Mondays
Oh
every for
no.
every episode, putting, writing a little ditty, and she has continued that. And she's been posting these either on Facebook, not on Facebook, she's been posting them on the I think on the YouTube videos. But she did write one for this one, and it goes like this. Vickery, trickery, plot. A cyclist a shadow had got. The shadow fired one, the villain went down, though thankfully murder 'twas not. There we go. Oh, they're always fun, and I like them so much. So thank you, Claire. Oh, good, she is watching. Good. I
She
don't know,
is, yeah.
time change, and I don't know.
I think
Sometime
she
tomorrow
is,
there.
I
She's in
think
the
she's
future.
18 hours ahead right
She's
now.
in the future.
She is in the future. Let me check.
Oh,
All righty. Let us begin. Um, Watson gives us this overview of Holmes's career after the hiatus until 1901. From the years 1894 to 1901 inclusive, Mr. Sherlock Holmes was a very busy man. It is
thank you
safe to
for the
say,
specificity with dates, Doyle. Chronologists are very happy with you,
are
except
they? It
or
is,
are they?
yeah,
Yeah.
it is safe to say there was no public case of any difficulty in which he was not consulted during those 8 years, and there were hundreds of private cases, some of them of the most intricate and extraordinary character, in which he played a prominent part. Um, uh, right, Doyle does seem to be putting a kind of time frame on these stories, something he has ignored in the past, just throws years and dates around willy-nilly. But here he almost seems to be saying the stories that I'm telling you now, like Watson is saying, the stories I'm telling you now are from 1894 to 1900, which means after the hiatus.
Mhm.
But that he gives a 1901 date is interesting.
Yeah.
Is is he saying that that's the end? Like, is that when Holmes? Because but we don't. That we're not going to go into when that happens in the future that Holmes retires. But
Um, I mean, I have not, I can just hear Brad Kefauver in my head going, Madeline, Madeline, here's the information you need.
he's a
N
chronologist. Yes,
yeah, he runs the Sherlockian Chronologist Guild. Um, no, I don't know enough about what chronologists say about that, but it's possible that no, it is like around 1901 is when Watson gets
yeah,
married.
But from the Doyle
Um,
question, in particular, is the way I look at, because I can't do the fictional game because Doyle wrote it,
well,
and
I can do both.
yeah, but but I but I like, but it seems to me the idea that he's giving us a kind of end date there, or at least in his mind, he's thinking this is when the stories will end, and knowing that this is being published in '04, that I'm giving stories from the very recent past, and
Hmm.
that's where the stories I have finish, but they don't eventually. But
Sometimes I think Doyle just put in the most random dates because he knew how obsessive Sherlock Holmes readers were, and he just wanted to mess with us, and he's just like sitting there cackling as we struggle.
I think that he is kind of intentional, though, about it. He is being unusually careful and intentional, I think, in at least this first handful of return stories, because, like, he makes sure that, for instance, that the empty house happens after the final problem has been published, which that's not nothing.
yeah.
Um,
Well, he
and
has to
then
play with those. He has to play with that time frame because the how long he's been away, and so now I've got to figure out that. But he doesn't bother to, because then there's all kinds of problems with, years. But here he's also, especially for his audience at the time, reading these stories for the first time. Um, I almost feel like, if you're reading for the first time, you're getting the idea that, like, these have happened in the past, but the very recent past.
right.
Like, it's just not that long ago that these things have happened. And at least setting that scenario up for his audience. That these aren't historical stories. They just happened recently.
Hmm. And also, this case specifically is an 1895 case.
Oh, it's specifically dated.
Or
Um,
it is always 1895.
yes.
Yes.
I had to.
Makes me so happy.
And Watson, I like this, that he says here. He says, "I have persevered very full notes. I've preserved very full notes of all these cases, and was myself personally engaged in many of them." This idea that Watson is a very active participant. That's key to these stories. We need Watson to be an active participant in the stories for them to work best. And he is.
Oh, I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead. No, you.
Well, I just since we're on the first paragraph, I wanted to mention it's so interesting. He says, I give preference to those cases which derive their interest not from the brutality of the crime, but from the ingenuity and dramatic quality of the solution. So
Yeah.
ingenuity, okay, he's talking about Holmes's mental powers, but then we've got to have the drama. It's because Watson always wants the drama in his stories, and we've seen Holmes criticize him for that. And then, two sentences later, I thought this was so funny. But this story I'm telling did not admit of any striking illustration of those powers for which my friend was famous.
Yeah.
I'm picking stories that show off how brilliant my friend is. But by the way, this story I'm about to tell doesn't actually show how brilliant my friend is.
I think he's lowering the bar. Like, he's not going to be like really spectacular here, but it's a really interesting story.
Yeah, it's really interesting because of the drama, and you could
Yeah.
just see Holmes being like, but but my science of deduction, that's what you're supposed to illustrate for these readers.
Oh, Watson
Eh,
wants the drama,
Watson's like, drama sells, Holmes.
Yeah, we gotta pay those princely sums for Baker Street.
And he mentions that it's Miss Violet Smith, the second Violet in the canon so far. The first was in Copper Beeches. There'll be two more. People who are continuing to read. Violets abound in Sherlock Holmes stories. So we get the second Violet here. And then it gets precisely dated. And this is, see, and on the one hand, I think chronologists love this. And for people that, I mean, if you're new to this and you're thinking, why do they keep talking about chronologists and what this means? chronologists are people who look at the Sherlock story in the Sherlockian community. Chronologists look at the stories and they piece them because they're told all over the place, different years, different times, and they want to piece together a consistent chronology of Holmes's entire career. The problem is there winds up being all kinds of contradictory information about dates given and when this story could possibly have occurred. So it winds up being this wonderfully fun puzzle to put together in which not all the pieces are they're supposed to fit together, but they don't quite. So you have to explain why they should fit together. And this one is specifically dated that the Violet Smith visits them on Saturday, April 23rd, 1895. So chronologists should be like, excellent. I don't have to do a thing to figure out when this story happens.
Only there's a problem.
Yes. And the first problem is
It's a Tuesday.
it's a Tuesday. So in 1895. So like,
Which,
yeah. So
by the way, it should be a Saturday because that's when she comes back to town on her break from work for the weekend.
Yes. So
April 23rd is a Tuesday in 1895.
So it's, Watson got the date wrong. His notes are so scribbled because he has a doctor's handwriting, of course, that, he didn't quite like, oh, what date was it? Oh yeah. So but who knows? But I love these little pieces in the story. But hey, as far as I'm concerned, that's when the story starts because that's when he tells me that it starts.
Mm-hmm.
And Holmes is not happy that she has come to visit them because he is immersed in another case. Usually he's not happy because he thinks this is going to be stupid and I don't want to talk to this person. They're going to ask me something awful. And this time, though, because he's very busy in the abstruse and complicated problem concerning the peculiar persecution to which John Vincent Harden, the well-known tobacco millionaire, has been subjected. So another unpublished case, The Peculiar Persecution of the Tobacco Millionaire would be the title of it. But she comes in anyway, and Watson is Watson, right? The young and beautiful woman, tall, graceful, and queenly. Watson cannot, resist. If the woman's beautiful, he is telling you she is beautiful.
I mean, that's so Watson, we've had this happen before where Watson's like, especially with Mary Morrison, he's like, oh, she's so beautiful, tall, queenly, whatever. And then Holmes is just kind of like analyzing her, and the fact that she's the woman is just like not even relevant to him in any way. And he's just, as it says later, he's looking at her like a scientist looking at a specimen.
Yes. That's what he does. I mean, that's what he notices. That's interesting that you rode a bicycle here, and let me see your hands. Unusual, and Holmes notes that it's unusual too, or Watson does, that my friend took the lady's ungloved hand and examined it with as close an attention as and as little sentiment as a scientist would show to a specimen. But that's a real, unpolite thing to do, is to just take a woman's bare hand at this time and then just look at it. And it's also odd.
Mm-hmm. But I mean, we've had this in Scandal of Bohemia where emotion is like grit and a sensitive instrument to him. He's objective. He looks at women like specimens. Like, this is a recurring theme.
And he gets to do the Dr. Bell trick, which, he'll either do it to Watson or he'll do it to a client in the start of most stories. And here he uses it to talk about, oh, I thought you were a typewriter by looking at your hands, but I can tell now that it's music. You observe the spatulate finger end, Watson, which is common to both professions, but there is a spirituality about the face, which the typewriter does not generate. Which of course he would know he would know about the hands because he has written a monograph on that, this is from Sign of Four, a curious little work upon the influence of a trade upon the form of the hand, with lithotypes of the hands of slaters, sailors, cork cutters, compositors, weavers, and diamond polishers, and perhaps typists and musicians were also included in that monograph. So,
but it's such like Victorian determinism, which I think is alien to us today, because we think of the world in terms of social mobility, and somebody can be born poor and then kind of make their way and be successful and all of these things. But for the Victorians, it really was sort of like what class you were, what was not just kind of, oh, who has more money. It really defined your character. Like, many Victorians really thought if you were lower class, it doesn't just mean like you had less money. It meant something about your character, and that's how they justify their class system. Is the people at the top, the aristocrats, are the ones who are supposed to be there because they have the qualities needed to be in the upper class. They're more noble, or they're more capable of reason. They're less prone to kind of vice, which is why when you get characters like Dorian Gray or Dr. Jekyll, and you have these aristocrats just descending into vice, that would have been so terrifying for the Victorians. So of course he looks at her and she's like, well, or he looks at her and he says, well, you must be a musician. You can't possibly be a typist because there's something noble about your face.
Yeah.
It's really that Victorian idea of like your class and your body and your physiology defines your character. This also gets at this Victorian practice of trying to deduce a person's character from their skull and all of these things. Like, your body and your birth really defined your character for the Victorians.
I mean, Holmes says that there's no difference between the hand of a typist and a musician. It's the other thing that gives it away, this kind of aura she gives. So that's where he's making the final judgment on it. The same thing that Watson notices, that she is kind of beautiful and queenly. That means
I mean,
that means that she's not a typist, a lower class typist. She is actually a musician. I mean,
the beautiful and the queenly and the spirituality about the face. I mean, that really is the Victorian what is the science? It starts with a PH and it's
physiognomy.
Physiognomy, where, like, again, you look at somebody's face, you look at their facial features, you look at the shape of their skull, and you deduce their characteristics from that.
That's phrenology, right?
Yeah, phrenology is the shape of the skull.
Okay, gotcha.
Well, that's the other one.
Physiognomy is,
I mean, they were related,
right?
And they were both, of course, very racist sciences. So it's Sherlock Holmes is just kind of, he might not say, phrenology or physiognomy, but that's what he's doing. Like, that's what his deduction is based on. That's part of what the science of deduction is. You have these Victorian beliefs about the body and class just kind of embedded into the very way in which Watson and Holmes think about the world.
She also he also mentions that, oh, from your complexion, I can see you're in the country, but that she obviously gets more sun. But then she says it's near Farnham on the borders of Surrey. And I just have to mention yet another unpublished case here. It was he mentions to Watson that that was the year, that was where we took Archie Stamford, the forger. So the case of the Surrey forger, I guess it would be. But Stamford, I can't help but think, right? And I think lots of people have written about this. Stamford is the friend of Watson who he runs into in London after he's returned and says, hey, I have a friend looking for rooms. Why don't you come meet him? And Stamford is the one who introduces Watson.
He leads Watson to Sherlock Holmes and immortality. That's what the plaque says in the Criterion bar, I think.
Is Archie a relation, or is Archie that Stamford? Hey, it's I don't know. It's not that unusual, I imagine, but there it is. That's for people to speculate upon and write their pastiches. As I'm sure there have been Archie Stamford pastiches I think all the unpublished cases have pastiche.
Oh, I'm sure. I mean, obviously Giant Rat of Sumatra more than like anything else, but yeah.
Yeah, and it's much more exciting to register with the giant rat of Sumatra than the curious the case of the curious forger from Surrey. So,
Mhm.
all righty. Well, Violet is gonna give her story regardless of Holmes not really wanting her to be there. He has already Watson is along with that young, beautiful woman, tall, gracefully, and queenly. He also says she had come with a determination to tell her story. And now when she gives it, she does it with great clearness and composure. Um, that this Violet is no shrinking Violet. I mean, she is. I think this is that queenly part that he described her as, that she has a kind of bearing that she's almost an authority here.
I mean, again, it's the class thing. She has discipline over herself, her emotions, her body, even if, she, excuse me, she's in distress, she's still able to express that with composure. And of course, I don't know if I'm jumping ahead, but of course, there's some relation that went off to Africa to seek his
Yeah.
fortune. I mean, that's all over the canon. You have some British man, usually, who goes off to Africa or Australia to make his fortune, sometimes South America, and dies or disappears, or you don't know what happens to him. So just this reminder of the empire, the British Empire, and its peripheries, all of these distant places that have so much bearing on what is happening in kind of the British heartland.
The colonial connections that happen in these stories, it's always there. I mean, basically her story is her musician. She had a musician father as well. And who performed
Conducted.
it. Yeah, conducted, but I think where she says the old Imperial Theater, this is almost a dance hall. I mean, it's not quite, but it's not like high high, high art, the place that he's
I actually looked it up, and it used to be, it doesn't exist anymore, but it used to be right next to Westminster Abbey, so like prime real estate.
prime real estate though. There you go. Um uh they but then she had an uncle, Ralph, her father's brother, who went to Africa and South Africa. And she's gotten a letter from, well, actually, there was an advertisement in the Times, in the London Times, inquiring for our whereabouts, her and her mother, who are still around. Her father's dead now. You can imagine how excited we were, for we thought that someone had left us a fortune. That's what you think? You see,
Yeah,
like,
I every
these
every time
whereabouts.
somebody's looking for me, I'm like, oh yeah, they have money for me.
Whoa, I must be rich. Well, so they did. But that kind of says something about these characters without maybe without even doing recognizing it, is that their poverty is such is that they're hoping they can get out of it, that they
Well,
want a
and
better
it's
life.
not something that that like she was born into or
Yeah.
anything. So it's kind of Austen-ish.
Yeah.
Um,
Father's died, and what can she do now? All
right.
I can do is teach music, which isn't going to pay me hardly anything. Um, so
No, some things haven't changed.
yeah. But
The
Mr.
arts still don't pay.
But they answer the ad, and Mr. Carruthers and Mr. Woodley meet her, and Holmes interrupts her during this, which is what he does. This is a great illustration of the way he conducts his the clients tell a story, but he will interrupt them at times to make sure he gets certain points. When was this interview? Last December, 4 months ago. He'll have some other interruptions too, but she meets this Woodley and Carruthers. Woodley is the seemed to me to be a most odious person. He was forever making eyes at me. That expression is hilarious, making eyes at me. Um, but he is a coarse, puffy-faced, red-mustached young man with his hair plastered down on each side of his forehead. The red mustache, I think, is funny because that seems to be part of this is why he's odious. She's not a fan of the red mustached men. But the other one was nice to her, and Carruthers is older but nice. And she also mentions that she is engaged to Cyril Morton, who is an electrical engineer. And
Which is cute because Holmes notices he's already figured out that she's engaged, and engagement rings, as far as I can tell, were not such a thing back then. So it's not necessary that she would be
yeah.
wearing one. So I kind of wonder how he knew. Um,
Well, that's his deduction, right? When she says, "I was sure that Cyril would not wish me to know such a person," he's got to think
yeah,
like
I suppose.
Cyril's either going to be a male relation who's close to them, or he must be a lover, and he couldn't be a male relation
Because
because
he'd be taking care of them
he would have been,
otherwise.
and he would have
Yeah,
been with them
that makes
there
sense.
anyway.
Well,
Yeah,
and the male
Yeah.
relation would probably be the one to inherit then.
yeah. And then if she had one, well, they would be out of luck, Carruthers and Woodley. So with their
Yeah.
scheme, um, uh, but Carruthers is older. Much she says was a much older man, was more agreeable, dark, sallow, clean shaven, and silent. And then he's the one that suggests that she come and teach his daughter music, and he's going to pay her 100 a year. Just an enormous sum for a
I
music
mean, every
teacher.
con requires an investment.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think it was the New Annotated that said that was twice the going rate for a governess, which is funny because this is
She's not even a governess.
right. And similar to Violet Hunter, who is getting paid more than half of what she
Yeah.
normally was at the
Clearly,
Copper Beaches.
clearly violets just get overpaid. That is their lot.
Yep.
They get overpaid but end up in weird,
End up in
sketchy
danger.
situations.
Yes.
Yeah.
So, well, she agrees to go there. She's like, well, yeah, she's taking the money. Um, but then she also mentions that Carruthers was a widower, but he had engaged a lady housekeeper, a very respectable elderly person. And that's something for us to notice now that in the past, it wouldn't she couldn't go there. She can't go as a young woman to a house with a man without another older woman there who would kind of be the kind of chaperone and in charge. That's why she can go, because there's an older woman already living there, who we never get at all in the story. Well, she goes, she's telling the story, she goes, and the first flaw in my happiness was the arrival of the red mustached Mr. Woodley. Um, and who assaults her, seized her in his arms one day and would not let me go until I had kissed him. And then Carruthers interferes, but Woodley just knocks him down because, he can. And and then this is when this is the weird part of the story. Now, this is all like Holmes has got to be by this point like, geez, will you just get to the interesting part? Because I don't care. Holmes couldn't care less about any of this stuff. But this is the interesting part. She's riding to the station, and suddenly there's a solitary cyclist behind her, a man, seemed to be middle-aged with a short dark beard, and he follows her, and she slows down, and he slows down, and she stops, and he stops, and then she lays a trap for him at one point, and then he's gone. And, so this whole process occurs, and this is the interesting thing. For Holmes always needs something interesting for a case, for him to take his time to think about it. There's also an illustration for this. Well, actually, I'll share it. I'll just share the page as a JPEG because it's clearer. And here she is on her bike, riding very upright. Now, she seems to be just riding with a regular skirt here, which is difficult, which some women did and could master, and it's fine. She doesn't seem to have adapted in any way. Some women have the kind of skirt that they can then button off into pant
Mm-hmm.
legs. She doesn't do that. And here he is back here. We can't see a thing of him in this. So to keep it mysterious, I guess. Um, the but someone had written a note to me, sent me an email about Violet on the bike, and how here's what Rena wrote. I enjoyed the story and just wanted to share a note question. I don't know if Doyle meant this. In the years indicated, a woman on a bicycle would have been considered a new woman in quotation marks, independent, athletic, career, politically service-oriented, and engaged in the public sphere, sexually liberated, perhaps some people would think a new woman is. Her willingness to ride the bicycle and then to do so alone on a country road reinforces this.
I
Is
mean, yeah, there's also quite a bit of anxiety. The Victorians very much were clutching their pearls about women riding bicycles because the way you sit on a bicycle, there was all of this anxiety, how would this affect women's reproduction and so on, sitting on the bicycle seat and the way that you do that can't be good for women's health, for reproduction. And so there was really just all of this like pearl clutching about it. So that's why Violet Hunters is so or that's why Violet is so interesting in as you said, her willingness to ride the bicycle. But then at the same time, it seems that she doesn't really have any of the other characteristics of what you described as the new woman. I mean, she's happy to just be engaged and get married and settle down, it seems.
And
she's certainly not active in the public sphere.
And she makes the decision that she mentions that, well, there was a housekeeper there, so it's okay for me to go there, with the implication of that, that she doesn't seem to be a new woman, but she is. She's well, or would readers of this time look at this and say, like, you see, this is what happens to women ride alone on bikes, You need to stick with.
Oh, I can well imagine.
Yeah.
I can imagine there were readers who had that interpretation, although it doesn't seem like Holmes and Watson, think that, but certainly I think people would have read it this way.
She just seems to be very practical, and I am curious as to like how long she has been living without, like, with just her and her mom, without her dad. But when it's just you and your mom, you gotta get by and you gotta do things that maybe also even you're not comfortable with, but you gotta do them.
I mean, this is a time then too, especially with bicycles that it's a craze. Bicycles are invented, and then in the mid 19th century, and then by the 1890s, they've got this great design that works so well. And in England especially, there's this huge cycling craze. Doyle loved it. He was so much into this. It's funny how many pictures survive of him just standing next to a bike. Here's the from the Arthur Conan Doyle encyclopedia.
Oh, I was just pulling those up and you beat me to it. Yeah, he and his wife were avid bicyclists.
Here's him and Tui on this tandem bike, which is hilarious. This is early. And then
couples who bicycle together stay together.
And they went all over the place on bikes too. On this one, I think on another just more easier to use tandem bike. Here I like this picture of him and the kids here, and the wife and the kids here, and there's just the bike waiting for him. Like as soon as he's done pushing this baby around, he's going to go hop on his bike and go riding around. He loves riding around on his bike. Just how proud he looks standing next to his bike here. Ha ha, my bike. This is it. But it's also a sign of him as, he's a modern person. And I'm a modern, active, athletic person, and that's what this endeavor is about. And he did propose it for people and women too, and that he thought that it was a very healthy thing to do, that people should do. He even had all kinds of plans. He had a proposal for a cycling army instead of cavalry, they should be on bikes. Which it does, it sounds funny, but then again, I mean, you look around, like in certain areas, like going on, like any urban areas, especially, police on bikes now are everywhere. And I remember when that first started, many people thought it was a little silly looking to see cops on bikes, but it works perfectly in certain areas, and they can do their job so much better on bikes in some areas. And Doyle was all into this bike craze and loved it. So, but I do think that the Violet on the bike alone and I think at the end of the day it comes across in the story as a no-no. Like, she shouldn't have been doing this. This is her problem.
Well, she shouldn't have, but what other choice did she have?
And this has put her in danger. And now someone like Sherlock needs to come in and save her.
Mm-hmm. Although, it's weird too, because she ends up in this situation where she's offered too much, like way too much money to go take this position living with this single man who doesn't even have a horse and trap, even though he can pay her £100 a year, and she has to bicycle by herself. And it seems like no alarm bells really go off in her head about the whole setup, which, I don't know, maybe Madeline, you get this, where sometimes you read or you watch a story that's written by a man and you kind of go, no, if this was a real woman, like, the alarm bells would have gone off
Well, it's
and
interesting
right
you say
away.
that because the alarm bells went off for Violet Hunter, but they don't go off for Violet Smith. And I wonder if maybe that is actually a product of class, because Violet Hunter seems to be more of a working class girl, but Violet Smith is a lady. And I can imagine that Violet Hunter is just naturally more a suspicious person, if you will, because of like the world that she's been born into than Violet Smith would be.
Mhm. Yeah, I mean, I like that reading as well, because, I mean, Holmes
I mean, you're
immediately
not
points.
wrong about male writers.
Yeah, but I mean, just Holmes looks at this entire situation, immediately goes, he's paying you £100, but he doesn't have a horse and trap. Like, that doesn't make sense. But this doesn't seem to have occurred to Violet Smith.
Before we jump back in, let me take this moment to thank all of you for watching this episode. As a nonprofit organization, the Rosenbach Museum and Library depends on the generosity of friends and supporters like you to keep programs like this free and accessible to hundreds, thousands, I hope, of fellow Sherlockians worldwide. I hope you will consider supporting the Rosenbach and Sherlock Monthly by donation, which you can do at our website, or you could become a member. Membership gives you free museum admission, discounts on programs and courses, and exclusive invitations to member-only events. Part of membership also gives you early access to program and course registration. There are lots of great in-person and online programs and courses available now. If you're watching this in January 2025, we've just posted them on the website. Actually, they've been posted on the website for a bit now. We have some great online courses coming up that are beginning soon. I'm actually teaching Dracula on an online course, and that is, there are still a couple slots available in that. Oh no, there's not. That one's sold out. That one's Huck and James is sold out. Of course, on Adventures of Huckleberry Finn and Percival Everett's new novel, James, which came out last year, won the National Book Award. Of course, sold out. But members got to register for it early. Course on Northanger Abbey, sold out, Jane Austen. There's a course on Harlem Renaissance. There's a course on Ulysses. A course on Mary Shelley's Frankenstein and the Last Man, the other post-apocalyptic novel that Mary Shelley wrote about literally that, the last man on earth, after a plague wipes everybody out. And there's a course on the sonnet, which will be very good. But I also want to tell you about another biblioventure that we're going on soon. It's now available for registration, and this is a paid one. Most of the biblioventures we do are free for everybody to watch, but then we're trying to raise money for the Rosenbach as well. So we do these special subscription ones. We did one on the Hound of Baskervilles last year, worked very well. This time it's on The Picture of Dorian Gray. And for 8 episodes in February and March, I will lead a conversational annotation with a team of rotating co-hosts, including Anastasia Klimchynskaya.
I am so delighted to be on that one. I'm also teaching The Picture of Dorian Gray this semester, and I'm so looking forward to rereading it for the umpteenth time.
Excellent. We will be Anastasia and I and Petra Clark and Sam Nystrom and Paul Chapman will be providing context and insight about Wilde and his book. And we'll also, in this one, because you'll watch it because it's a private subscription show, it's a lot easier for us to take questions from you to contribute during the show. So you have an opportunity to do that. The Rosenbach has a significant collection of Oscar Wilde manuscripts, books, and photographs, which we will feature in several of our episodes. And I'll also be doing the signature cocktail thing with original recipes that provided to all subscribers to the program. And I was just gifted this the other day. It is an absinthe spoon, so I can.
It's too bad that absinthe is disgusting, but I am very happy for you.
Oh, I have some, and I've used it in plenty of drinks. But it'll be nice that I can put this to good use.
No, but I think a Wilde show is the perfect one to just have fans do ridiculous cocktails.
Just tune in for the fact that what's it going to be like to watch Ed drink absinthe and try to talk about books. I don't know if it's gonna if things will really go haywire or what, but we will certainly find out. So
it'll be great.
The Picture of Dorian Gray is open for registration now. I really hope you'll join us on that one as well.
Remind us, when is the first session?
February 3rd is the first session. So it runs on the Mondays in February and March, 8 straight Mondays in 2025. I always like to give the year too, because you could be watching this show in the future. If you're watching the show and it's like 2030 and you were like, wow, I'm watching this show. Like, that'd be cool, huh? So no, it'd be really cool because I just mentioned it to that person in the future that they're watching. So,
there will be somebody in 2030 watching this.
There you go.
Definitely.
So, how about 2100? So.
Yeah, if the human race survives.
Oh, the human race is going to survive, but YouTube may not.
There you go. So, all righty. Carruthers has has Violet in his employ, and now Woodley has hit on her, and she rebuffed him, and he was horrible about it. But now Carruthers likes her too. He is Mr. Carruthers takes a great deal of interest in me. And how do I know this? She says, because a girl always knows. That he is starting to pay attention to her. Holmes asks what he does for a living, and she says, he's asking about him. What does he do for a living? And she says he is deeply interested in South African gold shares. So this is what he has told her, at least. It makes him sound rich. But Holmes realizes, well, he's not rich. Why doesn't he have a horse? Why doesn't he have a carriage and horses? If he was rich and he lived out in the countryside, he would have that. So that's another clue that Holmes notices. Well, she leaves and just tells her that I hope we shall have nothing but good news from you. Just let me know. Let me know what's going on. And he does this in a few cases. He did it with Violet, the other Violet too, in Copper Beach. She's like, send me a telegram if anything happens. That he's, kind of putting it together in his head. And now Watson says, as he pulled at his meditative pipe, so I guess not the disputatious clay. This is the meditative pipe that he's smoking here. He says, it's probably just some secretive lover beyond all doubt. Curious but there are curious and suggestive details about the case.
Well, I
So
like the way that he starts off, though. He says, "It is part of the settled order of nature that such a girl should have followers, but for choice, not on bicycles and lonely country roads,"
yeah,
which is funny. But
no
it's
stalkers.
interesting.
Don't
Yeah,
stalk them.
right, right. But he's like,
Well,
it's part of the settled order of nature that a pretty girl is gonna get noticed. And it's interesting because like in I was just thinking about like Sign of the Four, where Holmes is like, "Oh, I didn't notice that Mary Morstan was pretty," but but there's but Holmes does actually. He does actually. Whatever you want to make of it, he is not actually blind to a girl being pretty.
I mean, he notices it. He just notices it, the same way he notices her hands. It's just a piece of data. But also the settled order of nature. I mean, he's used that phrase before. Or no, he will use it in The Hound of the Baskervilles, where he's talking about that whole hound ghost whatever thing. And he talks about it as being against the settled order of nature. So that's like such a
Mm.
Yeah.
scientific phrase. Like he's turning her into a specimen. He's turning human behavior into like data and equations and, if X, then Y.
And in a sense, Holmes Holmes is completely correct. It is a secretive lover. I mean, it's not a spoiler for us. We've read the story. We're talking about it now. It's Carruthers. It is someone who is secretly in love with her, following her. Like he's figured that already. Like that's who it has to be. That he pieces together, and then he gives Watson this kind of like a preface on how to solve this. Like this is what you would have to. This is what we need to know. Who are the tenants of Charlington Hall? What is the? How about the connection between Carruthers and Woodley? How came they both to be keen upon looking up Ralph Smith's relations? And what sort of a menage is it which pays double the market price for a governess but doesn't keep a horse? So who's at Charlington Hall, which is close, which I haven't mentioned, but that's the hall that she passes on her drive. And it seems as if that's the only place that the cyclist could have disappeared to through the woods to Charlington Hall. And what's the connection between Carruthers and Woodley? Because they don't seem to be friends, but they're clearly connected. How are they connected to her uncle, and why are they paying so much for a governor? Why is Woodley paying so much for not even a governess in a sense? It's more of a music teacher than a governess. So that's how you solve this. Holmes is like, all right, you want to solve? Like he could just give that to Watson. He could go solve it. Well, Watson fails that completely, right? When he's off on the case. But Holmes has told
Oh,
him how
poor
to solve it.
Watson.
Um, there are some stories where in this one, I mentioned in the beginning when Holmes said that she was he noticed that Violet right away was a cyclist. Watson immediately says, "Oh, that's because he can see the Watson isn't doesn't have to be told this." He says, "I observe the slight roughening of the side of the sole caused by the friction of the edge of the pedal." So when he hears Sherlock say this, he recognizes it right away. And Watson will do this in stories that he understands Holmes' method and can see it after Holmes says it. But in this case, he lets us down. He lets Sherlock down, and I think he lets me down as a reader a little bit too, because I think Holmes is almost right in this. Like, how could you have not realized this? Um, the he sends Watson off. He gives him these questions, and then he says, "Watson says, you will go down? No, you will go down." Um, and because for Holmes, it may be some trifling intrigue. Because as he's piecing it together, he realized it's got to be a secret lover. These are the questions. If it's just leading to the secret lover, I don't care. I've got to solve this case of what's his name, John, the tobacco millionaire. That's the case he's got to work on. He can't be bothered to investigate this with that other case. It was a tobacco millionaire case. Must be interesting, So so he sends Watson off, and And Watson goes, investigates the scene of the young lady's adventure, he calls it. Um, uh, and then he sees her, and then he sees no, first he sees the guy, right? Yeah, he was clad in a dark suit, and I saw that he had a black beard. And he sprang from his machine and took it into a gap in the hedge, disappearing from my view. And then he came out and he follows her. And then she turns her bike around and races at him, and then he darts off. Uh, and then Watson sees him a few minutes later, standing among the trees. He says his hands were raised, and he seemed to be settling his necktie. Holmes will comment later about that. We'll get to that at the end. But Watson says, it seemed to me I'd done a fairly good morning's work. And then he goes and he asks about the representative, like who's renting Charlington Hall. And he's told Holmes this whole story. And Madeline, you have it there. Read that. Mr. Sherlock Holmes listened with attention. Read that little paragraph.
Okay. Mr. Sherlock Holmes listened with attention to the long report which I was able to present to him that evening, but it did not elicit that word of curt praise which I had hoped for and should have valued. On the contrary, his austere face was even more severe than usual as he commented upon the things that I had done and the things that I had not.
You have that passage there too, Anastasia?
I'm sorry?
You have that passage too?
Yes.
You want to read that? Read that next paragraph. This is when he really insults him.
Your hiding place, my dear Watson, was very faulty. You should have been behind the hedge. Then you would have had a close view of this interesting person. As it is, you are some hundreds of yards away and can tell me even less than Miss Smith. She thinks she does not know the man. I am convinced she does. Why, otherwise, should he be so desperately anxious that she should not get so near him as to see his features? You describe him as bending over the handlebar. Concealment again, you see. You really have done remarkably badly. He returns to the house, and you want to find out who he is. You come to a London house agent. What should I have done? I cried, aghast with some heat. I don't know if you want me to keep going.
No, that's good. Poor Watson, he thought that he had
It,
done a
it
great
makes
job.
me think, okay, Holmes, if you wanted Watson to hide in the right place, tell him where to hide. It's not that hard.
Yeah, he expects him to like, if I've given you these questions, you should be able to figure out what to do to solve them. And Watson doesn't do any of that. So
It's like when people who are good at math try to explain how to solve something and they think it's really
Yes.
obvious. And then you're like, but I don't get it. And they go, well, but what don't you get? What's so difficult to understand? Like, it doesn't even cross their mind what somebody might not like automatically understand about this.
Yeah,
Like
Watson,
he's just thinking on a completely different level because this is his bread and butter. Like this is his profession. So it doesn't even cross his mind to tell Watson, like go hide there.
because what Watson has only discovered is like, well, her story was right, And I was like, yeah, I knew she was telling the truth. I didn't need to check up on her. And uh that he tells him he should have gone to the public house, the bar, the local pub. That's where you find the country gossip. And then you would have,
Not that I think Watson would have been good at eliciting the country gossip.
No, he would
Can
not
you
have.
imagine him trying to just like chat people up and then Woodley shows up in like Watson getting into a fight, Holmes doesn't mind getting into a fight, but I think Watson would be a little too much like getting into a fight in a public house is just beneath him. He's a respectable man.
Well, Holmes is going to have to find out for himself now. And before he goes, he said, "We'll have to go down and next weekend to look at again the Saturday when she's doing this again, riding her bike again." Um, and in the meantime, that Violet writes to them that now Carruthers has proposed marriage to her. Um, Holmes says our young friend seems to be getting into deep waters. Then the case certainly presents more features of interest and more possibility of development than I had originally thought. Now he's like, okay, I need to go down myself and test one or two theories which I have formed. So he goes, and comes back. And I find this fascinating because these little adventures that Sherlock goes on without Watson, then he always gets to tell the story afterwards. But I mean, it would have been different if Watson had been there, but this does occur. And this actually, well, he doesn't go, oh, but he doesn't go in disguise here. What I found that whenever he's in disguise, he never takes Watson. He only talks about how he did this thing. But Watson will see him in disguise returning and be fooled by him, but he never goes off. But Holmes has gone off to investigate himself, but when he returns, he arrived at Baker Street late in the evening with a cut lip and a discolored lump upon his forehead. But he was immensely tickled by his own adventures and laughed heartily as he recounted them. You are aware that I have some proficiency in the good old British sport of boxing. So,
I think it's from here that we actually get Robert Downey Jr. as Sherlock Holmes. This is the story that we get it from.
Yeah. And that, well, we've known all along that he's good at this, or at least,
right.
I mean, in Study in Scarlet, in Watson's list of things that, skills that Sherlock has or
Proficiency at
doesn't have,
boxing.
he is an expert single sticks player, boxer, and swordsman.
I do wonder how Watson found that out in like the first
Yeah.
2 weeks of living with Holmes, but okay.
Someone just mentioned it one day. Oh, I'm quite a good boxer.
Could be
just because
Holmes is
a man says
single
he's good
stick
at boxing
like somewhere,
doesn't mean he
maybe.
is.
Sorry.
Oh no, that's fine.
And Gloria Scott, Holmes mentions that in college he's not interested in study so much. He's just interested in the only sports he's interested in are fencing and boxing. But then in that Sign of Four, we get that exchange with McMurdo, the guy who's guarding the lodge, Pondicherry Lodge, and he says to Sherlock, I don't think could have forgotten me. Don't you remember the amateur who fought 3 rounds with you at Allison's rooms on the night of your benefit 4 years back? Holmes says to him. Not so, Mr. Sherlock Holmes. God truth, how could I have mistook you if instead of standing there so quiet, you had just stepped up and given me that cross hit of yours under the jaw? I'd have known you without a question. You're one that has wasted your gifts you have. You might have aimed high if you had joined the fancy being the sport of boxing. And Doyle loves boxing. Doyle writes a novel about a boxer called Rodney Stone, which is he writes it, I think, during the hiatus when he's not writing Sherlock Holmes stories, he writes a whole serialized novel about a boxer called Rodney Stone. He loves this sport, and Holmes uses his fisticuffs in, I think, 2 stories before this that we know of specifically, right? Naval Treaty. When Joseph Harrison comes out of the house and he catches him, we've done this episode. Holmes says he looked murder out of the only eye he could see with when we had finished. And in Final Problem, he's jumped by one of Moriarty's goons in an alley, and then Holmes says about him, the gentleman upon whose front teeth I have barked my knuckles. He lays him out too. So Holmes is good at laying guys out here. And first he finds out, he goes to the pub. He finds out that the person who has rented Charlington Hall is a clergyman, a former clergyman by the name of Williamson, who is rather unecclesiastical, peculiarly unecclesiastical. And he has weekend visitors. And they are a warm lot, sir, says the barkeep to him. So, and then Woodley comes out, and and he hears that because he's heard Holmes asking questions, and he comes in. Who was I? What did I want? What did I mean by asking questions? He had a fine flow of language, and his adjectives were very vigorous.
That's a F word storm there.
He ended a string of abuse by a vicious backhander, which I failed to entirely avoid. The next few minutes. So they're going at it. Were delicious. It was a straight left against a slogging ruffian. I emerged as you see me. Mr. Woodley went home in a cart.
I love the way that Jeremy Brett does those lines in the Granada version. It's so good.
Here is the illustration. Well, first look at the Paget illustration, and here he is. And deer stalker, thank you very much, because he's gone out to the country. Paget puts him in a deer stalker. Put mine on too. What has always struck me about this picture every time I look at it is that, wow, Sherlock Holmes is beating up Teddy Roosevelt. If that isn't a dead ringer for Teddy Roosevelt, like it's Teddy Roosevelt and he's punching him. So there he is, like the straight left, he's giving it to him. I like the barkeep back here, like, whoa, but just
not again.
Yeah, Woodley's fighting someone again, but hey, Woodley's finally going to get knocked out this time, because Sherlock can just take care of him, and it's just the tall, erect. It's the Paget's giving the form here to what men did then as they were fighting, this kind of very formal posture, and there he is just going at him, but the illustration by Frederick Dorr Steele, shows the aftermath, and I find this fascinating for different reasons. As an illustration, it's really interesting, the kind of crowding that he does, and just gets so many people and things into this tight space here. For his illustration. So much detail in here. But two things strike me. Number one is the look on Sherlock's face here, like completely like, I can't believe I had to knock this guy out. Ugh. Looks so above it all.
You know where that comes from, don't you? That specific Sherlock pose?
No, which one?
That is very specifically a Gillette promotional image, and the reason that his hands are like that is that, like, originally he is shooting up.
Ah, there you go. What also strikes me about this, though, is the way he has drawn Woodley here. It looks like an old man. It's like, man, Sherlock just knocked out this old guy. Look at him.
I mean,
I don't think it's
in both
intentional, but
cases,
it looks like an old man.
the hair is plastered.
It is.
Is
They both got
depicted
the
as being
plastered hair here.
Yeah.
Yeah. The
Well,
Teddy
and of course
Roosevelt
somebody's got
hairstyle.
some brandy for him. Quick, the brandy.
Quick, the brandy. So yeah.
No, I don't think I've ever had brandy. I should fix that at the next BSI weekend.
There you go.
This is me sitting here at the table here, smoking my pipe, hat on. I'm like, yeah, this is all right. I'm watching this all day. This is great. Watch this fight going on at the bar. That's what I do at the bar. This fight going on, I'm watching it.
I love in the Granada episode the way that after Holmes like definitively knocks Woodley out, everybody just applauds.
Yeah, they've been sick of this guy for so long.
Yeah.
All righty. Well, Deerstalker is, of course, it's not mentioned in the story that he's wearing. Doyle doesn't mention he's wearing a deerstalker, but Paget puts a deerstalker on him when he is, in the countryside, because he thinks that's the hat he should be wearing. Because Paget had one. There's a picture of him. One of the early episodes of Sherlock Mondays, we shared the picture of Paget wearing his deerstalker, and that's what he liked to wear. Put on Sherlock.
Well, I also find it so funny that after Holmes criticizes Watson for accomplishing nothing, and then he returns and he's like, yeah, okay, I didn't learn anything either. I bet Watson is just internally like, huh.
Well, he does learn that he has learned that it's an ex-clergyman that owned the thing, but he couldn't get much more information than that. So he says some intrigue.
Well, and then Violet sends the letter to say that
Yes.
she's
Oh,
leaving.
did I skip ahead? Is that happened then? Is that after? Yeah, okay.
It's immediately after. Yeah.
Yes, that was after. So first he has the thing, then they find out that she's leaving his. Oh no, the first letter was she found that Carruthers had engaged or
Mm
asked her to marry him.
hmm
Now we get a letter saying that uh she is leaving him. So I guess, well, what did Holmes learn by this? That the clergyman and that there's some kind of partying going on there,
Well,
but
and that Woodley is staying at
and
that
it's
hall
and Woodley's
that
staying
she
there, yeah.
bicycles right past.
And it's so he knows, but that's not learning much either,
No,
right?
it's not. It
Yeah.
is not learning much.
Um, they the man on the bicycle was doubtless a member of those weekend parties at the hall of which the publican had spoken. And now they have to go and investigate again for her last trip. She's going to leave the place finally and head into the city for their last trip.
Oh, can I just mention something really quick from Violet's letter? Because she also says it's not just the situation with Carruthers that Woodley's also showed back up. But she adds, he was always hideous, but he looks more awful than ever now, for he appears to have had an accident, and he is much disfigured.
Yeah, an accident called Sherlock Holmes.
I love that.
It's amazing.
All righty. Madeline and Anastasia, can I ask you guys to talk about Holmes and Watson for a moment as they start to chase or start to run towards the carriage? And I'm going to be right back.
Mhm. Yeah, well, actually, so they go into the countryside and actually the first thing that struck me even before they start, chasing the carriage and all of this, the way Watson describes it, a rainy night had been followed by a glorious morning, and the heath-covered countryside with the glowing clumps of flowering gorse all seemed all the more beautiful to eyes which were weary of the duns and drabs and slate grays of London. So he's like, "Oh, look at this beautiful countryside," and it reminds me of that other story, and I actually think it's Copper Beaches with the other Violet, where
Yeah,
yeah, where they go to the countryside and Watson's like, "Oh, look at this beautiful countryside, and it's so peaceful." And Holmes goes, "Yeah, I actually think it's horrifying because more undetected crime happens in the countryside than in the city because in the city there's more people, it gets caught, it gets noticed, whereas in the countryside it happens on these secluded estates." And nobody notices it. And a lot of home stories are there's something nefarious happening at some secluded estate, usually to a woman who has no protections, and nobody knows because the
right.
man is master of his castle. It's secluded. That woman has no protections. So
Speckled
it's
Anne, very famously.
yeah, yeah. And so it's so interesting that there's so many Holmes stories that are, precisely about these kind of crimes and these women with no protections put into helpless situations in the countryside. Um, and of course, there's quite a bit of also 19th century Gothic fiction that is written about domestic spaces and all of the kind of dangers that exist within domestic spaces for Victorian women who have no legal protections in a lot of ways. So you can imagine Watson's there. She's like, "Oh, la la la, it's so pretty, it's sunny." And then Holmes is just looking around, being like, "There's probably a crime there. There's probably a
Yeah.
crime there. Who knows what's happening in that house?" And of course, the crime that they're about to witness, but also
Yes.
probably more crimes that they don't see.
As they see her trap coming towards them, a little carriage trap is a small one horse drawn, carriage. Uh, and they have to run to it because of the position that they're in now. And I love this that Watson, I was compelled to fall behind. Holmes, however, was always in training, for he had inexhaustible stores of nervous energy upon which to draw. Um, wasn't it in Hound of the Baskervilles that Watson's bragging about how I'm always fit and I can run, well, no, obviously not. At least a lot
Uh,
was not next to Sherlock.
yeah.
Mm.
Also, How did the Baskervilles what would have been at least a few years
Yes.
earlier, and one way or the other, Watson does have an injured leg.
Yeah.
So
Well,
also
Watson's getting
sometimes that,
older. Yeah.
yeah, sometimes that also might bug him more than other times.
And if he says Holmes, however, was always in training,
Mm-hmm.
that means I'm not in training. I go play billiards at the club. Then I come and
And
sit there.
gamble my money, so Holmes has to, hide my checkbook.
And then I come and sit in the study and sit in the rooms at Baker Street and read books. So that's what Watson does. Um, uh, so he sees Holmes from afar, throw up his hands with a gesture of grief and despair as he's gotten to the carriage, and Watson arrives, and it's too late, Watson, too late. Fool that I was not to allow for the earlier train. It's abduction, Watson. Abduction, murder. God knows what. Let's see if I can repair the consequences of my own blunder. Um,
So now you're taking her seriously.
yeah. Well, it's interesting because he was suspicious before, and before they go, even when Holmes is suspicious that they should go, there is some deep intrigue going on around that little woman. It is our duty to see that no one molests her upon that last journey. Watson says, I confess that I had not up to now taken a very serious view of the case. That this is um what men all, and especially pretty women, men always stalk them. What's the big deal? That's just what happens. And especially if he's running away, Watson figures like he's running away. He's obviously not a danger to her. But Watson's wrong. And he's wrong about who's on the bike too. So he doesn't think
Well,
he
this
doesn't
is
think it's
yet
fun.
another story in the
Yeah.
long annals of women saying,
Yep.
I'm in danger, I'm being threatened, I'm being whatever, and law enforcement saying, oh, well, it's fine, you'll be fine, it's not
Yeah.
serious.
Well, Holmes at least recognizes that there is some danger, and that's why they have to go down.
Eventually.
But he's again too slow to act to save someone. The last story we just covered, Dancing Men, he's too slow to act in time, and murder happens. This his client is literally murdered. His actual client is murdered. And both times in Dancing Men and in this story, he's waiting for the last piece to fall in place before he goes and takes the train. He's really trying to, and here the last piece is that she's leaving, and he's like, "Oh, so I need to go down there," but he's got to wait until Saturday um, to take the train. Now, in the Copper Beaches, this happens too. He waits to hear from Violet, forget it, and he's almost too late. Now he does get there in time, but he is like she could have been killed before he got there or gotten rid of in some case if he knew that if what's his name knew that she was Rucastle knew that she was
Mm-hmm.
doing something, that she had
Mhm.
figured him out. Speckled Band, much earlier story that Doyle wrote, no matter where chronologists will put it. He takes the train ahead of time to the scene, Holmes does. He gets there before, the stepfather, names are hard,
Oh,
gets there.
well, now you're making me forget.
Grimsby
It's
Roylott.
the
He gets there
Royla.
before Roylott shows up. But now in these last couple stories, he's either waiting, like with the Dancing Men, he wants to get that final clarification that who Abe Slaney is, and then they're too late to get a train tonight, so they have to wait till the next day. And here it's like, oh, well, let me figure this out. And like, oh, now we got to wait till Saturday after they get this final thing that she's going to leave. So, but he's almost too late to save her. I mean, they'll save her in a sense, but they were almost too late. And but we'll get to that in a minute. What happens? Um, but it's pointing out he's got two stories in a row where Doyle's like Holmes fails, and Watson's telling stories of failure in a sense that like Holmes fails to, he kind of figures it out, but he doesn't succeed in time to stop a crime from actually occurring. And the other story, obviously, he doesn't even save someone from being killed. So Doyle's always interested in twisting these stories into something else. And of course, the very first Sherlock Holmes short story, Scandal in Bohemia, Holmes completely he gets
I
beat.
mean, but that's okay because the King of Bohemia was never in any actual
Yeah.
danger. It was also
Yeah.
kind of how do I say this politely on the air? He was not a very nice man.
And it's certainly okay by me because there's a woman that beats him.
But yeah, well, maybe this is kind of return. I imagine the return of Sherlock Holmes is introducing Sherlock Holmes to a whole new generation of readers.
Mhm.
So Doyle is like reintroducing the
Yeah.
stakes here that Holmes can be beaten.
Yeah. I mean, his Scandal in Bohemia is 91,
Hmm
1891. We're now in 1904. This is, these aren't, some of them are the same magazine readers, but many of them will be new to this.
hmm
Oh man, I hadn't thought of it that way, but
Yeah.
now that I'm kind of old enough that they have done remakes of my beloved characters I grew up with, this makes sense.
Yes. A reboot? What? This one is new. It's not new anymore. Sorry.
I mean, since I've been a teenager, they've done like three different versions of Spider-Man and like just to give an example, and it's
You will now be teaching students. You'll be like, yeah, the Robert Downey Sherlock Holmes. They'll be like, what? That's like an old movie.
and my
What are you talking about?
students have never even read Sherlock Holmes, like none of
Oh yeah.
them.
But the rest of it that goes on too, it'll be old to them because that's still new to me. So
Ugh.
I can remember teaching a crime literature course, and I wanted to do a film, and I picked and I wanted to do something. I was doing a couple old films, Friends of Eddie Coyle. I can't remember something else really old. And then I thought, oh, something new that they'll get. And I know, Reservoir Dogs, Tarantino. And then I said that to them, and I got blank looks. And then I actually even discovered that there were a couple kids in class who weren't born when Reservoir Dogs came out. I was like, oh my God, I had no idea. So that's new to me. So there you go. All righty. Now they see this solitary cyclist coming towards them, and he pulls a gun out. Pull up, I say, or by George, I'll put a bullet into your horse because Holmes and Watson have now gotten into the trap.
And I'm just like, that's your horse, dummy.
um, and he doesn't reveal himself who it is yet. It's Carruthers
Right, right.
now, but he hasn't revealed himself yet. Pistol in hand. They've got her, that hellhound Woodley and that blackguard Parson. And then he runs distractedly with his pistol in his hand towards the gap in the hedge. They find a young groom in there, fellow about 17 with a big terrible cut on his head, but he's okay. So let's leave him alone.
Poor kid.
Yeah.
He's lower class. He's not important.
Yeah. He's breathing. Let's just go. And then they run through and they come upon what looks like the worst wedding ever.
Well, and first I want to note, we got to go. We got to leave this room because we have to save her from the worst fate that can befall a woman.
Thank you. Yeah,
Which
I have my notes here. Yeah.
it's there are several things I can think of that this would mean in the Victorian context, where, by the way, they don't really have divorce. So if you're married to the guy. But
Right.
it seems like they're thinking of perhaps something other than just marriage here. But of course, Doyle has to be tactful. He can't say explicitly what he means. He has to kind of like couch it in a euphemism.
He's not quite saying that, she's going to be raped. She's going to, against her will. It's going to be, well, that is definition of it, but she's going to be trapped. I mean, she's going to be trapped in a marriage. It's an abduction. But it could just be murder. I mean, he really, he would say murder if he meant murder, but that's really the worst thing. They could just kill her, and they may very well have been planning to do that anyway. Um, uh, but yeah, that worst fate that can befall a woman. That this is the chivalrous man writing a story in what 1904. That is the worst fate
Mm-hmm.
for the man. Um, they come across this scene, and we'll look at Paget's illustration of it. Well, first, as they come across it, it is here, and they yeah, as they run up, here they are running up. Here's Carruthers in front, and Holmes with his deerstalker here, and Watson, and the description is they hear her scream as they're running, a scream which vibrated with a frenzy of horror. Um, Carruthers says, "Too late, too late. By the living jingo." An odd place for a little slang like that, but there you go. Is that an Australia? I didn't look that up. I wonder, is that some kind of Australian thing he's saying, or South
Oh, hold
African
on,
thing
hold
he's
on, hold on.
saying?
There's a note for it here. Give me just a sec. Secularized version of By the Living Christ. The association of the term with resurrection was reinforced in the 19th century by the popularity of the Ingoldsby Legends, 1840, which associated the name Jingo with a saint that gets murdered and then gets sort of reanimated.
Saint Jingo?
Very weird. Well, Saint Gengulphus. I
Okay.
can see how it ended up being
Hey,
Jingo.
Jingo's easier to say, I guess,
Yeah.
for these Victorians.
Mm-hmm.
So, um, well, here they are running up, and she's gagged, leaning against the tree. They gagged her obviously because she did scream. And here's an elderly gray-bearded man wearing a short surplice over a light tweed suit had evidently just completed the wedding service. Um, Here's Woodley, gaitered legs parted wide, one arm akimbo, the other waving a riding crop. His whole attitude suggestive of a triumphant bravado. And they're married, I gasped, Watson says. And then Williamson bows with mock politeness, and Woodley advances with a shout of brutal and exultant laughter. Williamson is the ex-clergyman, I'm sorry. "You can take your beard off, Bob." And then we finally realize this is Carruthers. And then he raised his revolver and covered the young ruffian who was advancing upon him with his dangerous riding crop swinging in his hand. And now we go to the first picture of the story. There we go. And I can remember originally seeing this, and I thought this was Holmes.
Yeah, it does look like Holmes.
He's got the Holmes profile, and now clearly
Uh-huh.
here's Holmes next to him. They could be brothers. Maybe it's Mycroft is Carruthers. But they do look alike, but clearly the hat we know. I mean, and here's Sherlock. So, and
Mhm.
here's the story where he shoots him. But the whole shooting is just he raised his revolver, covered the young ruffian. "Yes, I am Bob Carruthers, and by Lord, I'll be as good as my word. You're too late. She's my wife." "No, she's your widow." The revolver cracked, and I saw the blood spurt from the front of Woodley's waistcoat. He spun around with a scream, fell upon his back, his hideous red face turning suddenly to a dreadful mottled pallor. The old man burst into a string of foul oaths, as I have never heard. Like, oh my gosh, I've never heard a clergyman say that. And he pulled out a revolver of his own. And then, enough of this, Holmes says, "Drop that pistol. Watson, pick it up, hold it to his head. You, Carruthers, give me that revolver. We'll have no more violence. Come, hand it over. My name is Sherlock Holmes." Everybody's got a gun. It's like gun, gun, like everybody's pulling out a gun all at once. Like suddenly it's an American Western story.
I was about to say, yeah, it feels like that.
What's not that long ago, Brad Kefauver and I were talking about this story, and the line, "No, she's your widow." Brad was like, "That's a James Bond line," and I'm like, "Yeah, it is."
Yeah. Um, and just like I can't think of another Sherlock story where three guns are out in the scene. And somebody's just been shot too, and then there's three guns out. So the only surprise is Woodley didn't have a gun himself. But the clergyman does. The ex-clergyman pulls out a gun. That's why he's got the short surplice on, so he can quick reach his gun. If he's got the long gown on, he'd never be able to get it. He'd have to get it up and then get the gun. But he whips his gun out. It's guns ablaze here. But also that the Williamson cursing so much that Watson has never heard him curse so much before. Hopefully we'll get Anastasia back. I don't know how she jumped out there. They
Oh, Claire
Yeah.
just made a good comment. He brought a riding cop to a gunfight. Good
Yeah.
one.
So something that nice job, Claire. And then I like the Watson. He says, "Hold it to his head." Like that's the way you cover somebody in a Sherlock story. This is what happened in Dancing Men last week when Abe Slaney arrives. Holmes puts the gun right at his head. It's like this is how you cover somebody in the Victorian age. Like if you make a wrong move, guess what? I'm literally shooting you in the head. Like you're dead if you move. I have to mention too that in last month's episode of Dancing Man, I was wrong about this because I also said that Holmes did this to John Clay in the Red-Headed League when he came up through the tunnel. That Holmes,
Oh, yeah.
but he
He
did
has a
not.
riding crop.
He has his riding crop and he knocks the gun out of Clay's hand. I had gotten that wrong, so I wanted to correct that. I must have conflated these two in my head, or the dancing
Sure.
in that
Sure.
one in my head. But Holmes takes charge of the scene right off the bat. He says, and I like the dialogue here. Um, he says, hand it over. Who are you then? My name is Sherlock Holmes. Good Lord. You have heard of me, I see. I will represent the official police until their arrival. And it's just this great little, exchange. My name is Sherlock Holmes. That's got to be hard to do. I can't recall if Brett does it, but that's one of those lines of dialogue that it's hard to do without sounding silly.
He does it, but he does it in Greek interpreter.
Yeah. Oh,
In
he does?
the way that they do the climax, yeah, when
Yeah.
they run after the bad guys.
Well, you have heard of me, I see. He's representing I will represent the official police until their arrival. That's an unusual thing about the about Sherlock that he would actually admit to being a representative of the police. Something that he is usually not a representative of. And something that he usually disdains, the way they do things. But he says, I must detain you all under my personal custody. So he's altering it a little bit there. And then Watson says the strong, masterful personality of Holmes dominated the tragic scene, and all were equally puppets in his hands. Um,
Williamson and Carruthers found themselves carrying the wounded Woodley into
yeah,
the house.
they have to carry Woodley in. Well, I mean, Carruthers shot him. He should.
Right.
And then they all come in and oh good, Anastasia's back.
Yay.
I'm so sorry. My internet just randomly went out for like 2 minutes, and actually I think there was some weird power surge and the power went out for like a minute and then came back on. I don't know what happened with that, but where were we?
were they, all the guns, and now my name is Sherlock Holmes. I'm taking you into custody. And uh
Have we discussed the fascinating part where he's like, I'm representing the official police,
yeah, isn't
Hmm.
that
as if he
odd?
has some kind of official, I mean, I don't know how Britain works, but in America, if you have some random guy who says, I'm arresting you on behalf of the official police, you'd go, no, I have a set of constitutional rights, and you can't just do that.
Well, but Holmes has a strong, masterful personality which dominates the tragic scene. Watson tells us how he can do this. That's
I
why.
mean, it's a crime to represent yourself as a police officer when you're not one, but
He's representing them. That's all. Until they get here, he says, I'm going to make a citizen's arrest. Um,
I still have questions, and I would love to see a lawyer's take on this. So, Ira Matetsky, if you're watching, I would love your thoughts.
there you go. Well, they take him in, and then Holmes, and then they're like, oh, Holmes is like, they're not married. Like, Carruthers is worried, oh no, and is she going to be married to Roaring Jack Woodley for life? Holmes is like, "Yeah, they're not married. The marriage is a sham." And it just raised the question too, really, did they really think that this was a real wedding? Like, if you got to gag her and do the ceremony, and the certificate is a forgery, clearly, the marriage that it's that obviously it's not going to hold up. But that begs the question: is that did they think that then obviously he's going to rape her after this, and then she would acquiesce and be like, okay, like I'm stuck, I can't, like I can't do anything about it, or are they going to kill her? Because they're not left with any other alternatives. She either has to accept the marriage, or they'd have to get rid of her. So I think there are implications to this that doesn't take long to think about what would happen if Holmes doesn't arrive. What would have happened to her? Would have been
Yeah, I think that she
basically,
died.
yeah.
And I hadn't thought about it quite like that before, but yeah.
Well, and she has an actual fiance who, presumably would be very angry about all of this and get the authorities, try to fight this, bring attention to it, and then, that's she's she's not and tell her not to acquiesce.
Interestingly, though, apparently Holmes was wrong about Williamson being able to solemnize a marriage, which is
Yeah.
wild to me. It seems like if you're not a clergyman anymore, you shouldn't be able to solemnize, you shouldn't be able to still have those kinds of rights and privileges. Like, what the heck?
The law at the time did. I mean, he is in a sense right. Once a clergyman, always a clergyman, but none of it would have worked anyway because it was against her will, obviously.
Right. That
There
and
wasn't a certificate,
that's
and
where it falls apart.
none of that, would
Well,
have.
and they don't have an actual marriage license.
Yeah. So, well, now we get for the end of the story that now that it's all done, Carruthers reveals um why this his part in all this. I loved her, Mr. Holmes, and it is the only time that I ever knew what love was. It fairly drove me mad to think that she was in the power of the greatest brute and bully in South Africa. That you planned for her to be in the power of, by the way, Carruthers.
And
I
also,
mean, you
apparently, he didn't love the mother of his daughter. That's something that jumped out at me when he's like, "This was the first time I knew what love was." I'm like, "Okay, so I guess you didn't love the mother of your
You have a
child."
child, so yeah. Or is that child a sham? Did they
Oh
Mm,
did
boy.
they get a kid from somewhere? We
I
never
mean,
we
it's the
never see her.
Victorian period. You could just find an orphan on the street.
Yep. So, um, they uh he says well, why didn't you tell her? And he says she would have left me, and I couldn't bear to face it. Even if she couldn't love me, it was a great deal to me just to see her dainty form about the house. to hear the sound of her voice. I love Watson here calls him out on this. He's like, you call that love? I should call it selfishness. Um, uh,
It's like,
so
this is why it makes me so angry that Carruthers, gets off scot-free at the end of this because okay, too little too late. Like, okay, you attempted to protect her after you put her in this
yeah,
situation in the
you put
first
her in
place
danger. Yeah.
and then kept that information from her, okay, fine, like you've done this to her and now you're in love with her. Step one would be to, oh, I don't know, tell her the truth.
Yeah. Well, clearly, but that's when if you truly loved her, you would have. But he's it's selfish. It's obsession. It's he wants this. It's not about her. Um, well, they've had to up this plan here because they found out they had a telegram that says the old man has died. Her uncle Ralph has died. So it wasn't that he had died before, as they told her. He had been hanging on, and now he's dead. And the whole plan was one of them would marry her, and then they would split the money that Ralph Smith had made in gold mining in South Africa. Um, I have to point out, because I always do, that when he tells the story, um before he tells, well, first the old reprobate, the clergyman, bursts into another volley of bad language. Watson thinks that Doyle thinks this is hilarious, I guess, that this keeps happening. Um, but when and he tells him, don't tell him the story. And Holmes says, your reverence need not be excited. Your reverence. I like that he says that to him. Your reverence need not be excited, said Holmes, lighting a cigarette. Now, he's not home. He's not at his Baker Street quarters or whatever, so he doesn't have his pipes there ready for him at all.
You mean you don't just carry around your pipes with you?
Well, now you do, but actually, in Holmes's day, it would have been less likely, especially for a gentleman, to smoke outside of the place where he smokes. Didn't have to be a smoking room, could be wherever it is, but it was less likely for someone like Holmes or a gentleman to smoke outside then. Younger men did, and certainly the working class did, but it would have been more unlikely for Holmes to do it. But he does have a cigarette. And he doesn't need to have a cigarette. Not only does he have a cigarette, that even when he's done the cigarette, Doyle mentions that he throws the cigarette into the fireplace. Like he's calling this to mind. Like in Doyle's head, that there's something like he's a deliberate smoker. He is, and Holmes is a deliberate smoker. He doesn't just smoke for pleasure. Um, and he's not and when he smokes cigarettes, which is often in the canon, but he's not just smoking cigarettes all the time, like he's, addicted to cigarettes. He just smokes them occasionally, usually for an occasion. It's after dinner, or it's, at another time, a specific time when it's appropriate to smoke a cigarette. And it's also sometimes smoking a cigarette, it's kind of like post-coital. It's this act, it's like after an action in the relaxing after the fact. And I think that's what's happening here with him smoking the cigarette here. All the commotion has just happened here, and now I'm going to smoke a cigarette, and we're going to talk about what happened. We're going to finish this thing up. So I can't help but notice all the tobacco smoking. Sorry.
Well, and then Holmes says that Williamson came from South Africa with Carruthers and Woodley, and Williamson goes, I've never been in Africa in my life, so you can put that in your pipe and smoke it, Mr. Busybody Holmes. So then Holmes's answer is, His Reverence is our own homemade article.
That's another great line.
It is.
There's some wonderful insults in this story.
There really
Very,
are.
yeah. I mean, you don't get Holmes sarcastic like this that often, but that's really funny. Well, we find out that Woodley has won the right to marry her in a card game on the boat.
Ugh.
And then apparently after then they fight, and which Violet has witnessed, Woodley has gone off and joined up with an a cast padre. He knew some ex-clergyman who was also a criminal, that he could get to help in this game, that they would just, kidnap her and force her to marry him. And uh and and that's it. That's the case. Holmes rose and tossed the end of his cigarette into the grate. I have been very obtuse, Watson. He said, when in your report you said that you had seen the cyclist as you thought arrange his necktie in the shrubbery. That alone should have told me all. So, which
I don't understand that.
I think it's what he was doing is he was adjusting his beard on or off kind of thing, that it's got nothing to do with the necktie. It was about Watson saw his hands go up here and he thought it was a necktie, but it must have been because it was a false beard. That's the only thing I can make of it, because then he doesn't explain what he means by that.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's what I thought as well.
And then that because she's been fainted and lying in another room there, they says, oh, go up to her and take her home. And then he says, if she is not quite convalescent, you will find that a hint that we were about to telegraph to a young electrician in the Midlands would probably complete the cure. Which I'm also assuming means that, like, oh, if you just mention her, her fiance, she'll perk right up. Like,
yeah, that's what I took that to
that'll get her
mean.
excited.
I hope that's what he means, and not, oh, we'll tell your fiance what happened and then he'll leave you.
I don't think so. That doesn't.
That'll get
I
her.
don't know. I'm very disenchanted with the men in her life after this story. I mean, oh, by the way, where is Cyril in this entire story? I mean, she goes to Holmes, okay, but maybe you should also tell your fiance, hey, there's this weird dude following me, like, could you maybe come, like, walk me to the station or something? I don't know.
Yes.
She read the Copper Beeches and thought, hey, Sherlock Holmes will help me. He helps this other Violet.
They then Holmes says that, well, here comes the police, and then he gives Carruthers his card so he's like, if you want me to be at the trial, I'll be at your disposal. So, because even though Carruthers put her in all this, he at least did his best to get her out of it. Did his best.
Frankly, I mean, I think Holmes is
good.
being too nice here, but okay.
Yes. Well, we get a postscript.
Claire also mentioned maybe the daughter was a consideration, because if Carruthers had been in jail for a long time, the daughter would have effectively been an orphan.
That's a fair point.
Yeah.
I mean, all this story reveals to me is
that's even his own
how
kid.
flawed the entire Victorian system of, like, money and property and everything is, and how helpless it leaves so many people. I don't know if this is what the Victorians would get from it, but to me, it just makes it so clear.
Well, we get a postscript on this story, and the postscript is Watson says, in the whirl of our incessant activity, it has often been difficult for me, as the reader has probably observed, to round off my narratives and to give those final details which the curious might expect. Each case has been the prelude to another, and the crisis once over, the actors have passed forever out of our busy lives. But here I can tell you that Miss Violet Smith did indeed inherit a large fortune from her uncle, Ralph Smith, and that she is now the wife of Cyril Morton, the senior partner of Morton and Kennedy, the famous Westminster electrician, and Williamson, the clergyman, and Woodley, the red-mustached Woodley, were both tried for abduction and assault, the former getting 7 years, Williamson getting 7 years, and Woodley getting 10 years. And the fate of Carruthers, I have no record, but probably got off after a few months. So Carruthers gets let go entirely. Doyle wrote about this in letters around the same time. These are all letters around the same time that I'm reading today. Well, actually, there's when he's writing the story in May 1903. First, he said that actually the solitary cyclist was supposed to happen before Dance. It was the third story, and Dancing Man was supposed to be the fourth. But Doyle suggests that they switch those. Greenhoff Smith apparently doesn't like Cyclist, and nor did he like Norwood Builder. And Holmes says, as to the cyclist story, I'm sorry, Doyle says, did I say that? Doyle says, as to the cyclist story, I did not like it so well, nor was I satisfied with it, and yet I could make no more of it. It has points, but as a whole is not up to the mark. But if I get 2 out of 3, it is as good. It is a good prop. It is as good a proposition as I have ever had. The Cyclist is a better story than 4 or 5 that have preceded it in the complete series. You will appreciate more fully now my intense disinclination to continue these stories, which has caused me to resist all entreaty for so many years. It is impossible, underlined, to prevent a certain sameness and want of freshness. The most one can do is to try to produce such stories that if they had come first and the others second, they would then have seemed fresh and good. That I hope to do, and I don't think we are much off the rails up to now. Anyhow, I'll do my best, and no man can do more. So he didn't think very much of this story, and and then another letter he suggests that we put this. He says with Dancing Men, he says we could put this third, Dancing Men, and so separate the 2 crimeless stories. That would give a stronger start to the series. So he's considering Norwood Builder a crimeless story, which in a weird way is it's because he hides and some guy's going to be charged with him. I mean, he doesn't actually actively do anything in a sense to hurt the man. So like there's an argument about that, whether or not it would be a crime then, in court. But this is a crime story. Solitary Cyclist, okay? I mean, she was abducted and forced to be married. That's a crime. And
potentially almost murdered, yeah.
Yeah, and clearly it would have been much worse if they not saved her. I mean, this would have ended worse. But then Doyle has another letter, and he writes, and it's around the same time, but we don't have an exact date on it. I have gone over the Cyclist again. It strikes me as a dramatic and interesting and original story. So now he likes it after he's written it and thought about it for a while. But it has a weakness. The weakness lies in Holmes not having more to do. But Watson now prefaces his account by meeting this criticism. So that now he's noticed, because I don't think he added it, because we have the manuscript. I have gone over it carefully and could do no more to strengthen it. I consider that these 4 stories, so Empty House, Norwood Builder, Dancing Man, and Solitary Cyclist, these 4 stories will beat any 4 consecutive Holmes stories that I have written. So
they're pretty strong stories, these first 4.
Is this that strong a story for you guys?
I mean, sure beats a Case of Identity.
I mean, I find it interesting, and I mean, we've been talking about it for more than 2 hours, so clearly it provokes a lot of thought.
I think there's a lot going on in this story that I do find interesting. In a sense, it's like it winds up fulfilling Watson, what he said about it in the beginning, that it's dramatic and really interesting, even though Sherlock doesn't have to do that much to solve it,
Yeah.
And we get the big dramatic ending. And come on, how many stories are 3 men with pistols shooting at each other, or at least holding them out? That doesn't happen that often. But I do find it really odd that Doyle thinks of this even as a crimeless story. Well, they managed to save her, so I guess it's okay.
You know, attempted abduction is still a crime.
And it's not
Like,
attempted. They did abduct
Yeah.
her. They abducted her.
And
Yeah.
Holmes even says that forced marriage is a very serious felony.
How do you think of something as a crime story when you say at the end these guys got 17 years combined in jail for it? Like clearly there was a crime, Arthur. So I don't understand what Arthur's thinking here. But he
we
does
rarely
like the story.
do.
He does like the story now, and he thinks, and I think it is too. I think there's something really interesting. It is very much like it's the Copper Beaches all over again,
Hmm.
in a sense. I mean the relation of the woman in danger in it is entirely different, but it's still a woman in danger in a country estate, uh, because somebody who wants money, and she is being used for that, and then Holmes has to go in and save her at the end, and uh, it works for me as a story.
Hmm.
Oh,
All right, well, Sherlockians, thank you for
this has
joining us.
been delightful.
It has been. Thank you. I'm so happy to have you on the show, Madeline. Anastasia, I'm always
Thank
happy to
you.
have you on my
Thank
show.
you.
This
So,
was a lot of
And I
fun.
will see you both in person next weekend.
Uh-huh.
if you're watching the show around in January 2025, we have our Baker Street Irregulars weekend in New York, in which many people are invited to the dinner. Not many, but enough, including Madeline going to the dinner this year. And it'll be a fun weekend. So I will see you guys both
Hmm.
there. Thank you so much
Are
for.
you skipping the show next weekend then? Like this show?
Oh yeah, well no, we're doing it this week instead of next week. Like it's because it's once a month now. So
Oh, right. Um,
Next month, coming up next month, we will return to talk about the adventure of the Priory School, and at least one of those co-hosts will be Nick Martorelli, who is the headmaster of the Priory Scholars of New York City, a Baker Street Regular Scion in New York, the Priory Scholars. So Nick is going to join us, probably someone else who I'll recruit while we were at BSI on the weekend. Thank you to the sponsor of Sherlock Monthly, Lisa Washington. We couldn't do these shows without the generous support of our patrons. You can support the Rosenbach through donation. Your support helps us create more programs like this and also care for our collections. And you can also become a member. Membership gives you early access and discounts to programs and courses. You can find out more at our website at rosenbach.org. Again, let me remind you to subscribe to this channel, to like these videos. I am Edward G. Pettit of the Rosenbach Museum and Library, where the game is always a book. Thank you. Madeline, Anastasia,
yes.
thank you so much.
See you in New York, Ed.
I'll
See you
see you
soon.
soon, and I'll see
And
everyone
Anna.
else on the next episode. Thank you.